Hey, I'm Jamey with Stegmaier Games, and I am the designer and the publisher of Vantage, an open world cooperative game where you crash on a planet far from the other players, and from a first person perspective, you are looking at your current location, and you can describe it to other players. You just can't show it to other players because they can't see what you see. And you are trying to accomplish your mission together to potentially find or determine and discover your final destination. Like, do you stay on the planet? Do you try to escape back to outer space? Or any goal that you decide is important to you. The game is built around the idea of freedom of movement, freedom of decisions, freedom of goals as well in the game. Vantage took me around 8 years to create. And during that process, especially the final year, I went through several near final versions of the game, a final prototype, 2 final pre-production copies, PPCs, and then 1 final mass production copy, an MPC, as I made a number of product design decisions to try to bring you the best version of Vantage. So I'm going to talk through those different versions today, starting with the something I'll talk about in a second. I have not looked at these in advance. I haven't looked at most of these except for the final version that I have been playing with in a while. So this is going to be fun for me to go through and talk about some of the product design decisions that we made. So let's start with this final prototype. So about I don't know, it was around I think around 9 months ago, might have been a little bit longer. It was a little bit longer. I sent our manufacturer Panda the prototype files for the game, so not the final graphic design files, because I wanted to get a feel for what all these things looked like when they were all in one box. And Panda sent me, this box is a little overstuffed, but it essentially looks like this. It's a giant box. And one thing you'll notice about this particular box is that it is bigger than, it is bigger than the final box that we decided on. It isn't as deep, but it's longer. And I'll explain why in a second, but one of the things I was striving for in Vantage is to not have it be an overly large box, even though it has 1,300 cards in the game. But actually, and so I wanted to try to figure out, once I got this version, how to make it a square box that is essentially the size of Tapestry, one of our other games. So I'll talk about that when I get down deeper, but there's a lot of stuff here, a lot of decisions made. In fact, we might spend half the video on this version because a lot of decisions were made at this point in time. This is when we were looking at some of the different token types. Here are some of the tokens that you use in the game. So one of the ways that you lose Vantage, or the primary way that you lose Vantage, is if any player's morale, health, or time tokens, you can see them a little bit easier here, are reduced to 0. The game then instructs you to read a certain passage, and then you might end the game there. There's also another decision that you can make. But we were going through different colors, trying to find the right colors. This is the only time in the game where there is a potential colorblind issue because these tokens share a track in the middle of the table. So we were going through these looking for colors that, to the best of our ability, are colorblind friendly. So these are some of the tokens. You can also see that we have cubes here. These at the time were the boost tokens in the game. Boost represents your experience, essentially, associated with different cards, your character's experience or your experience with specific cards that you acquire into your card grid. And so at the time, they were specific colors of tokens. Eventually, later in the process, we decided, for a reason I'll discuss later, to make them all the same color. What else do we have here? So we have a bunch of dice. So here's an early version of the challenge dice. These are the dice that so whenever you take an action in Vantage, you will succeed that action. But what you don't know is if you will lose time, health, or morale along the way, if it will take longer than you expected, if you'll get hurt trying that action, and or if you'll be demoralized from trying that action, from maybe it was more difficult than you imagined. There are ways to mitigate this, but there is a dice roll. You can mitigate before and after the roll. This is one of the early versions of these dice, and a few of the things that we changed, and you'll see this in later versions, but there is a time token right here. It ended up being a little small, and then this token, this icon right here, this represented, what was that? That was the setback icon, and we ended up changing that because looking at this, you can't, I don't know, it didn't really end up meaning anything in terms of an icon. I like the idea. It's essentially the St. Louis Arch times 3, but it didn't represent an actual thing that you might be doing, that you might encounter. So we changed that later. I will, of course, show you that once I get to that version of the game. We went through a bunch. of different versions of the skill dice. So skill dice are used as a randomizer in the game. Oftentimes you'll gain a random skill, and you'll then gain so you'll roll a die to determine what type of skill token that you'll gain. They're used for a few other things, but they're mainly a randomizing tool. And we went through a bunch of different versions. These are slightly bigger. So these are 16 millimeter dice, a standard D6 dice size. The challenge dice are a little bit smaller because you need to place them on cards. But we went through a bunch of different versions of the colors of the background of the die, so it would best offset the icons, the runes, the 6 different action types that you can see on the dice. We have wooden dice here. Originally, they were wooden dice for a long time, which I thought had a nice organic feel. But wooden dice when you roll them, they have a lighter sound, and they're just a little bit too light. I didn't find them substantial enough when I was rolling them. So we moved away from the wooden dice and started working with these plastic dice that had a little bit more heft to them. We went through a bunch of different colors. I talked about these with the play testers quite a bit to try to figure out the right color. These are all the colors that we experimented with. Kind of a swirl version, a pure white version, a light gray version, and a dark gray black version. Definitely didn't want to go that because we had the challenge dice in black. I think at one point the challenge dice were white. Went through all these. These didn't quite fit, but we ended up liking this off-white color. The off-white, I thought, offset the colors on the dice really nicely, the skill icons, and it had an organic feel to it. Ended up liking that the most. One other product or component we were testing at the time are these holders, these location card holders. So I mentioned in the introduction that when you were playing Vantage, you were always at a location, and Vantage is not a bird's eye view game. Like the vast majority of exploration games, you are looking down at a series of hexes or tiles or storybooks. In Vantage, you are the character. You are looking at the world from a first-person perspective. I'll pull up a location card in a second to show you what that looks like. But so the card is in front of you on this card holder. Here's a good one. So the very first location of the game is where you're all on the spaceship together. This is one of the few locations where you'll be together with the other players. So if this were an actual location on the planet, it would hold it in your card holder like this. So this would be your view at the table. You put that in front of you just like that. So I wanted to test this card holder because originally I was thinking that I wanted it to be angled such that other players couldn't see what was on the back of the card. Although at this point in the process, actually, that didn't matter. At this point in the process, there were going to be all 800 locations as large cards. This is an 80 by 120 millimeter card that I'm showing you right now. All the locations were going to be single-sided cards with essentially a solid back, so nothing on the back of the card. So I guess I'll talk about what we revised a little bit in a second. But this is the idea. The holder would hold your location, and there were going to be 800 location cards in the game because there are over 800 locations in the game. That will change, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. What else do we have here? I see some older components, some cards that I printed. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in this box. A bunch of notes that I had about the game. Okay, we're getting down to some stuff, and I won't spoil anything in this video. I'll use examples. So one of the things, these are just blank cards, but these are the 80 by 120 millimeter size cards, the large cards. Most of them are location cards in the game. And we went through different thicknesses and different textures. I ended up going with a non-linen version of these. This is not a card that you're really touching all that much, just sitting in front of you. And trying to find the right thickness that would be thick enough so the card lasts a long time, basically, but also was cost effective, because a major thing that I was aiming for in Vantage is that despite it being a game with a massive amount of cards and custom dice and some wooden components and art, just a ton of art in the game. There's so many unique illustrations. I think it's 1,600 unique illustrations in the game. It would be a reasonable price. I didn't want this to balloon up to be like a $200 game. I wanted it to be a reasonable price. And so one of the things I was looking at for just to save even a few cents here and there, so that cost would be seen in the total price that you would see when you buy it, is the thickness of the card. So looking at different thicknesses of cards as well. Okay, so we're getting down to what's actually in the box here, or what's in deeper in the box. So you can see what it looks like here a little bit. So you can see there's actually quite a bit of empty space in this box. The challenge is, so over here we have these smaller cards. So these are 57 by 87 millimeters. There are 900 of these. And these, like, they're based on the design of the game, there have to be 900 of these. These can't be double-sided cards. There are 900 of these cards. So once I got this box and I started trying to fit in, to try to figure out how to fit in all these location cards, I realized that if I really wanted a square box, that I could not fit 800 location cards in the game, and also that the cost of trying to include all 800 locations as individual cards significantly increased the price of the game. These are large cards. They are expensive to print. They're even bigger. If you've played Scythe, Scythe has 70 by 110 millimeter cards. These are bigger. This is 80 by 120. I think it's essentially a Dixit size card maybe. And so what I realized by looking at this prototype, or this prototype somewhat confirmed something that I was already thinking, is that I didn't need to make these cards single-sided. I was essentially wasting the back of all of these cards. And so I made the decision at this point to have all 800 locations on double-sided, on 400 double-sided location cards. But what that meant, going back to this card holder, is that I needed to make sure that either the angle of this card holder was correct, so no one else at the table could see what was on the back of the card. And that ended up being almost impossible to do. Like I have it at a pretty good angle, but still, if you look at it, you can kind of see what's on the back. And so what we ended up doing is instructing players once they get into their escape pod. So you get in this escape pod at the beginning of the game. There are 6 different escape pods. Each player gets in one individually, and each escape pod has 21 different locations on the planet that it might crash on. 21 different. So this escape pod has 21 different locations than the other escape pods. That you'll just keep this escape pod, which does have essentially a blank back. You'll keep that in your card holder for the rest of the game, and then every time you gain a location card, you just put it in the card holder, and that way no one can ever see the back of it. You'll see this as I go through some other iterations of this, of the pre-production copies. I think that's everything that we have for this early prototype of the game. Not really early prototype, but this uses all of my prototype graphic design, not real graphic design. So I'm going to pause the video for a second. I'll go get the early PPC. I'll be back in one moment. Okay, I'm back with the early pre-production copy. In this copy of the game, it's still a white box, so we haven't sent the art for the box to Panda yet. And what do we start to have? Okay, we start to have card backs. So we have actual graphic design on these cards. We have another version of the card holders. At this point, we were kind of just getting down to the nitty-gritty of the angle for the card holders and making this gap big enough to hold 2 cards for the reasons I mentioned a few seconds ago. And what else were we doing in here? So we actually have the board. So this is the board, or called the center. It is the one shared component in the middle of the table, and I wanted to make it double-sided. This one's a little thin. Like, we didn't go with that thick of a cardboard for it. It doesn't need to be that thick. In fact, thicker cardboard is more likely to warp, but this felt too thin and too flimsy, so I increased the thickness of it, added a linen texture, I believe, later on to make it a little bit more substantial. And eventually I'll change some of the graphic design on here, but it ends up being pretty simple, kind of this blueprint look. I wanted it to be somewhat muted because the colors of those tokens, I might have them in the box somewhere, but those time, morale, and health tokens, I wanted them to stand out on this. Along with the cards, you'll put a mission here, you put some destinies here, the challenge dice go up here. I wanted those to stand out from the board and be the main feature. In this version of the game, we have a bunch of things that are getting closer to being final. So we have a bunch of storybooks. So all the storybooks that come in the game, there's a total of, I believe, 9 different books, 7 storybooks, 2 more, plus the rulebook. So 10 total books in here. And at this point, yeah, so these are starting to be a little bit more final. There are, so the backs here, this is not final. This is the reference. This is kind of your turn flow. And this one, This is my graphic design. This is what we used for playtesting the game, and that I evolved during the playtesting of the game. Here's a fairly early version of the rule book, starting to look and feel a little bit more final. Trying to get that right. I'm trying to think if the materials for these will change all that much, but not really. The materials for these books pretty much stayed the same. Looks like this box. So in this box, yeah, okay. I'll try to show this to you without spoiling anything. I'm trying to figure out at this point. Yeah, I don't want to spoil anything for you. But at this point, I'm trying to figure out how to organize all these cards. And I started to come up with this system of having the 4 rows of the smaller cards over here. The numbers are at the top of the cards so that so you can easily find them. And then have the large cards, the location cards for the most part, in stacks over here, organized in 3 different stacks. And I think it was at this point that I realized that the cards, when stored vertically, they tended to bend a little bit and they took up more space. And so I realized that a nice trick that you could use, or that we could use in this game, is to tell players to store them horizontally, like, stacked like this, and then when you are ready to set up, you just flip them vertically. That leads to some insert design challenges that I'll talk about later. They're not in this insert, but that was the general idea, and a good breakthrough. It meant that the box really could be a square box the size of the tapestry box and not any bigger than that. It's already a pretty big box even in that shape. At this point, we do have I believe these are the final colors for all of the player tokens. Again, the cubes are still in the different colors. That will change later on. Skill dice are the same. Here are the challenge dice that were either going to be white or black. These are the more final versions with bigger icons. But it was at this point that I definitely decided that they would be black backgrounds and white icons rather than the reverse. And yeah, actually, at this point, I'm mainly focusing on how to organize all this stuff in the box. There aren't a lot of other elements here. At this point, it's just a white box, but we'll get to some modifications for the insert in the next version, the more final PPC, the pre-production copy. So let me pause right here and I'll go get that version. Okay, I'm back with the second pre-production copy, PPC, and at this point, we have a printed box. We have a nice printed box here, and this was really helpful to have a printed box even while we're still kind of testing some elements of the game, because I realized that we could use the sides of the box, as you can see here, to put words to the different icons in the game. So you have these icons on the challenge die: setback, time, morale, health, blank, roll, which is what you want to roll, and then all the names for the different skills/actions in the game. These are referenced, of course, elsewhere as well, but it's nice because you have the box on the table in Vantage, because you have to leaf through and find these cards. And it's nice to have these icons right here on the box so that you can easily, instead of saying, I'm going to take the red action, you can easily look here and say, oh, I'm going to take the overpower action. All right, we have the punch board here. The punch board has the coins and the skill tokens. And now we have all the books actually have the final, or near final graphic design. There is actually a change that happened after this. So back here you can see Carell, who was working on the graphic design for this game. He did something I thought was really clever, which is he used the color of the different storybooks, so blue in this case, for the color of the font on the back of the storybook. And this works sometimes. You can see it here. Here's the red one. I want to find the yellow. Where I get to the yellow one is the one where I realized it didn't work as well. This is the take action. Yeah, you can see it here. The take action. Clever design, but the words are really tough to read in this light yellow. And so I believe in the next and final version, at least some of these words change to a consistent color. I can't remember if the headers don't, but definitely down here on the card anatomy section, they do change color to something that's a little bit more readable. Here is what the box looks like. So you can see here now we have a couple different things happening. We have these 4 stacks of cards that are divided a little bit better. We have a colored insert instead of a white insert. This is a cardboard insert. And you can see these location cards that are in these face down stacks. One thing I forgot to mention in the previous video, or the previous section, is that these cards, because they are face down, I realized I didn't want players to spoil anything, even though it's a minor spoiler, but to have to be able to see the top location of each of these stacks. And so we created these cover cards to cover up whatever that top card is. Also, we realized while playtesting, or I realized while doing some playtesting at the PPC, that early on in the game, so originally locations, I showed you that spaceship location a little bit earlier in the video. Location 000 and 001. Those are the locations that all players share when you start the game. I should also have clarified, Vantage is not a campaign game. So every time you play, you're going to be crashing on the planet. You'll be approaching the planet with one of 21 different missions, and you will crash on the planet. That happens every time you play. It's actually a really fun part of the game because you start over from scratch, kind of like a roguelike game. But I realized that all players sharing these small location cards, 4 locations, 000 and 001, it was just a little tough to read. And those locations are pretty important because they help you set up the final steps of setup, really. And so we used this cover card to say that location, so we moved the locations, and it says location 000 and 001 are found on the back of the storybooks. I don't know if that focused well enough for you to read it. So we moved those locations to the back of this storybook. So this is the book of Vantages. This shows you that first. So you just put this on the table. This is much larger than that card that I just showed you. So imagine that this was the card. Now you have this big card with all these big instructions on them. And then there was one other location on the back of the book of secrets. So once your ship starts to crash, you then flip to the back of this one. And you can easily see this big location. The ship is going haywire, and some other instructions there. So just ways to more easily get into the game and have all players make sure they don't miss any important instructions. What else changed for the... Okay, so also compared to the previous insert, there weren't these little compartments over here. I realized that we needed some designated places to put the various components in the game, including these components that I'll talk about in a second. The card holders, the coins, the skill tokens. I don't see the skill tokens in this particular box. So I wanted some separate components. This will even evolve a little bit more in the final version, as you may have seen in the unboxing video. But the last thing, in playtesting the pre-production copy, one question that kept coming up was, why are the boost tokens, these essentially experience tokens, these cubes, why are they different colors? When do the different colors matter? Are players limited to the 10 tokens in their color? And the more I fielded these questions, there are clear answers to these questions, but I realized if players are going to be asking this much for something that doesn't matter, because the colors don't matter on the boost tokens. The reason that I had them color in different colors in the first place is in case players wanted to use the colors to mean different things, like put a red token on a card that had a boost ability dealing with the red action over power. After fielding so many questions about it, I realized, let's just change them all to the same color. But I wanted that color to feel special. I didn't want it to be, I didn't want it to be one of the 6 colors used in the game already, and I wanted it to feel special. And so we found this metallic silver. You can see it's a little bit shiny through this bag. Found this metallic silver that does feel special. It isn't just a boring gray. It is a fun metallic silver for the boost tokens. So that goes into the final version of the game as well. And at this point, I have figured out how to organize all these different things in the box so it fits really well. It's again, it's a lot of components. It's 1,300 cards, but everything fits really nicely in this box, and you can close it up nicely because the large cards are stored horizontally instead of vertically. You don't need to keep this, but I have it in the box anyway. One other component that I'll show you here briefly. So this is one of the optional add-ons. There are 3 optional add-ons: metal coins, wooden versions of the skill tokens, and player mats. So you note that in the box so far, I've not shown you player mats because you don't need player mats. You are creating a 3x3 grid of cards in this game, but you don't need a player mat to organize them. 3x3 is the biggest it can get. But I thought some players might enjoy having player mats. Maybe you want to be able to move your grid around a lot. Maybe you just like the feeling of slotting cards into designated slots. Or maybe on your table you find your cards sliding around a little bit as you place and remove dice and tokens from them. So I have these player mats. And so this was the original version of the player mat. You have the character printed on here, so you don't need to randomize your character at the beginning of the game. You just grab a random player mat. You can still randomize it with a skill die. The one thing that will change that you'll see a little bit later, other than the color, some of the colors change a little bit, so they're more obvious. But we had these gaps right here. I don't know if you can can you see that? Yeah, there's little finger gaps here to help you pick up the cards. And I didn't even think about this, but I found that it is much more intuitive to pick up these types of cards from their long edges than the short edges. For some reason, I don't know, you can try it at home, but when I want to pick up things off a mat, it is much more intuitive for me to pick it up this way than this way. And I thought it was maybe just me, but I then asked all playtesters, hey, are you finding it a little weird to pick up these cards side to side? And everyone said yes, so we ended up altering that. This is really a near final version of the game, but I'm going to show you one more, the actual final version of the game, to show you a few tiny things that changed at the end during the product design stage. Okay, here is the final MPC, the mass production copy of the game. This is the copy that happens like after Panda has already made and printed everything, but before they start assembling everything, they create one final copy of the game just to say, this is your last chance that if you find something that you really messed up that you need to change, you can change it at this point. I don't think, and usually it's just used for assembly, to make sure assembly, but we've been thinking about the assembly for Vantage for months at this point, many months. But this is the final version of the box. You can see every copy is individually numbered. We made 50,000 copies in the first print run. And yes, that's the final box cover. The three artists who created all 1,600 illustrations in the game over pretty much 8 years. Like they weren't there at the very beginning. They weren't there at the very end. But I would say maybe 7 years of work. We have the final board here, which... nice linen finish, some gold. I don't think the gold was in the previous version that I showed you. And one thing I changed here is I realized that depending on the way this is oriented and where I'm sitting at the table, where other players are sitting, that sometimes I wanted the challenge dice pool up top and the penalty section at the bottom. This is where if you can't place a challenge die that has a penalty on it, you put it here, or it has a blank, you put it here and you suffer the penalty. But I realized sometimes I wanted it to be the opposite. So on the back, mechanically exactly the same, except the challenge dice pool is down here. The penalty section is up here. So that's a little change that happened near the end of the process. All the storybooks fit beautifully in here at this point. Here are all the storybooks. Okay, I guess the main change, I'll show you a few other components here, but the main thing that happened at this point in the process, I didn't even mention this earlier. This is in the unboxing video as well. But if you look closely, let's see if you can see it. If I tilt this, I don't want everything to go everywhere. You can't quite see it, but so I mentioned during setup, you have to take these big stacks of cards and flip them vertically. And I realized that would be difficult to do unless you could get your finger underneath the bottom card. And so basically, in fact, I can show you by just removing the cards. At the base here, I added some finger holes. So you can get a finger in, and I'm right-handed, so I typically use my right hand to do this, but I realize not everyone's right-handed. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of other people who might use it, so I have a left side finger hole as well, so you can get your finger in there and pull out these cards. Now I need to put these cards back in without spilling them everywhere. There we go. Got to be careful. So this is about a third of the large cards in the game. Put those back down there. So the other change you may have mentioned as I was holding this up was, let's slide these cards over, was over here. One of the last things I decided to add is I kept thinking about it, and I was like, how nice would it be if instead of having plastic bags of components in these 4 slots, that you had little trays that you could pull out. Just pull out that tray and put the component on the table during setup. Make setup even faster in Vantage. And so we added them. We added these little trays. So one of the trays holds skill tokens and coins. One of the trays holds dice and boost tokens. And one of the trays holds the challenge dice over there. So just trying to maximize every little inch of space, every little millimeter of space in this box. The last few things in this box actually, this wasn't in there before. The stacks of, I mentioned the cover cards for the locations. We also added cover cards for each of the grid cards, or the hand cards, as we call them. You don't really have cards in hand. I think that was a term that we used earlier on. but they show the card range, the numerical ranges for the cards in these stacks. But we also added those card ranges to the outside of the box too. So someone, usually only one person is handling the cards in the box. They're putting cards to and from, or they're usually just extracting cards from here. But just in case someone else wanted to help and say, okay, it's going to be in this stack, we have those numbers on the outside of the box as well. I think that's all the stuff for the final version of the game. I mentioned that there are 3 accessories. I showed you the player mats a second ago. We also have the wooden skill tokens. Here are the wooden skill tokens. They're printed on both sides. And we have the metal coins in the game for the types of things that you might spend money on if you discover another planet in your solar system. And I think that's it. I think that's all for the tales from production, all the product design decisions that we made. There's probably a lot of like tiny little things that I missed here going through individual cards that would probably spoil stuff. But those are the types of things I was thinking about when trying to put this game together, to try to make a game that was easy to set up, as easy as possible to play, and offered a really good value for the price that you pay for it. Because I know you work hard for your money, and I just want to offer you the best value for all of our games. So I've been thinking about that for a long, long time with Vantage. How can I offer you the best value for a game that has so much stuff in the box? If you have any questions about these types of product design decisions that I made, feel free to ask them in the comments below. I'd love to hear about them. Or if you want to highlight anything that I mentioned that you'd love to see in other games that we make in the future, I'm happy to hear about that as well. Thanks.